Hello. We have a big program today, so I think that we ought to get started right on time. My name is Victoria Westhead, class of 1983. I'm parent class of 2017, and I'm happy to say now also 2019. I'm vice chair of the Pembroke Center Associates Council, a group of alumni and friends who support the Pembroke Center's work. Jean Howard, who really should be up here, who's the chair of the Associates, is unfortunately unable to attend today, but she does send her greetings to everyone. On behalf of the Associates, I'm delighted to welcome you all. I see a room full of students, family, alumni, faculty, and friends. And I'm welcoming you to the Pembroke Center's annual student prize and grant recipient presentations. It's one of the days that we look forward to the most in the year because it's always exciting to see what our young scholars have been up to. A quick word about the center. Some of you may be unfamiliar with our work. We were founded in 1981, and the center was named in honor of Pembroke College and Brown University, the women of Pembroke, and of course its predecessor, the Women's College. The Pembroke Center's research and teaching explore how gender and other issues of difference affect our thinking and the world in which we live, issues such as race, ethnicity, class, and religion. The Pembroke Center is home to Brown's Gender and Sexuality Studies concentration. It also supports two different archives. One, the Christine Dunlap Farnham Archive, which preserves the history of Brown, Pembroke, and Rhode Island women. It's also the home to the Feminist Theory Archive, which is an important collection preserving the intellectual history of feminist scholars, many of whom have worked or do work at Brown. I'm now going to turn things over to Debbie Weinstein, who already introduced herself, but just in case you missed that, Debbie is the Associate Director of the Pembroke Center and Director of the Gender and Sexuality Studies concentration, and Debbie will introduce all of our presenters. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Great. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the Pembroke Center to congratulate you on your research grants and prizes for your work, but also I think everyone this year is a graduate, so I also want to congratulate you on your wonderful accomplishment in graduation. I also, before turning things over to our prize and grant recipients, want to say a few words of thanks. And the first and most important of these words of thanks go to the friends, families, and supporters who are here today and whose support has made all of the difference. So thank you for helping these outstanding students get to where they are today. So I thank you all. And I also want to extend my personal gratitude to the members of Pembroke Center's Associates Council, whose generosity makes these grants and prizes possible. We would not be able to do what we do without you, so thank you very much. Thank you. Before introducing the undergraduate grant and prize recipients, I want to mention a couple of people who are not here because we also award grants and prizes to graduate students who generally don't come to this luncheon. But I just want to let you know a little bit about their work. So this year's Steinhaus-Zisson Graduate Student Research Grant recipients were the following people. Wanda Henry from History for her dissertation research on searching the dead and burying the bodies. Searchers of the dead sextonesses and women undertakers in England from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Rajuta Mehta from Modern Culture and Media for her project, The Repatriation Portrait, Women at the End of Empire, 1947 to 1953. And the third grant to Nicosia Shakes of Africana Studies for her project, Women's Theater and Feminist Activism in Jamaica and South Africa, a study of Sistren Theater Collective and the Mother Tongue Project. In addition to these three grants to graduate students, we also awarded a dissertation prize. And this year's recipient of the Marie J. Langlois Prize for an outstanding dissertation on, from any field on a topic related to gender studies or feminist analysis is Erin Kraft from the Department of Slavic Studies for her dissertation entitled Reading Revolution in Russian Women's Writing: Radical Theories, Practical Action, and Bodies at Work. It was an outstanding project. Now, in selecting the grant and prize recipients, I just want to let you all know that there was a committee. It wasn't just me, and I want to thank my fellow committee members, particularly Denise Davis, who teaches in gender and sexuality studies and is also the managing editor for the Center's journal, Differences. And one thing for you to know, these are actually highly competitive prizes and grants. The committee has to struggle because the submissions are almost uniformly outstanding, and if we had more to give, we could easily support even more research. It's a testament to really the phenomenal research that students at Brown are doing. So on to today's presentations. We have asked them each to speak for 5 minutes and then take a question or two. And I want to let you know, I know you have 2 sheets in front of you. One is a description of the prizes and grants, and another is a half sheet of paper with people listed alphabetically, and we will be following that alphabetized list. So the half sheet of paper in the middle of the table, which is also up on the screen. So the first presenter today is Chanelle Adams, class of 15, concentrator in science and technology studies. She was the recipient of the Lindamman Research Grant to support an undergraduate research project related to issues of women's financial empowerment. And I turn things over to her.
Okay, I just want to say thank you so much for everyone being here. I'm really honored to share a little bit of my project that I've been working on with all of you. As I said, I'm a student in science and technology studies, and my emphasis has been on ecologies of knowledge, which is the understanding that there's a plurality of ways of knowing in the world, and they each deserve to be rigorously studied and considered without having to be validated by a dominant form of knowledge. So my project is called Gender, Health, Commodity, and Power, Mapping Medico-Botanical Knowledge Practices in Northern Madagascar. So according to the World Health Organization, 80% of the world relies on traditional medicine practices, and in Madagascar, where there's a population that is largely impoverished and largely in rural areas, this number may be even higher. And this traditional knowledge system is called Pharmacy Gassi, which is a complex network of patients, healers, vendors, and plant collectors, which during the first iteration of my study, I tried to map out all of the different stakeholders in this process, who was collecting the plants, who was prescribing them, who were the patients that were interested in receiving this form of healthcare. And just like any form of knowledge, this knowledge is embedded in its culture. It has its own gender relations. It's embedded in tradition, health, and something that's very uniquely Malagasy. The ancestors play a really large role in the healing process. After doing the first iteration of this study, I realized that there was a huge gender component that I had not addressed in the first area, which is what I'm really excited to go back this summer and look at with support of the Lindamman grant. So women actually play a large role in holding this form of knowledge around healthcare, as they are primary caregivers, typically worldwide. And that's a Sakalava woman, which is the ethnic group in Madagascar in the region in which I'm working. But the Malagasy people aren't the only ones interested in this form of knowledge. Pharmaceutical interests since the colonial era have been interested in areas with rich biodiversity to develop drugs and health practices for Western diseases. So I have a picture of the botanical garden in France, which would extract plants and database them and give them new names, Latin names, proper names, as they would say. And now pharmaceutical companies engage in a process called bioprospecting, in which they collect a ton of plants and then test them for active compounds that are recognizable to the Western world as valid forms of healing. So this form of extraction really flattens this form of knowledge. It only talks about the knowledge on the terms of Western science, and it completely neglects the fact that all forms of knowledge, including this form of knowledge, is embedded in a social context, that there's ritual and practice and tradition and ancestors within the use of these medicinal plants, and to take parts that are only relevant to Western illness would be a disservice to understanding the knowledge system on its own terms. So my project is a collaborative research project to work with this community of practitioners to figure out a way to bring resources that I have to them, to work with them on a study that acknowledges them on their own terms. So the question is going to be very open-ended, and it's going to be mostly methodology that arises out of the field and a lot of participatory methods that come from a range of disciplines. So as I said, I do science and technology studies, but I'll also be using feminist science studies, which has been a large part of my training here at Brown. And also the idea of cognitive justice, which, as I said, is the idea that a plurality of knowledges exists and deserves to be rigorously studied and considered. And the research question I have moving forward is, what does it mean to study a marginalized knowledge system on its own terms, to subject it to being rigorously discussed and documented by thinking with and through its own cultural cosmology? And I'm very excited that I'm leaving for Madagascar next Sunday for the summer, which would not be possible without this grant. And so thank you again. And then what? So I'm actually a .5er, so I'm going to come back in the fall and finish the thesis, and then you can ask me that question when I'm done. But I just wanted to say thank you to the Pembroke Center and the Linda Pay grant. Also, my advisor, Professor Julia Gusto, who could not be here today because she's off in Brazil doing her own stuff. Barry Ferguson, who's been instrumental in arranging homestays in Madagascar, and of course, my mom, Abby Adams. And then the community of practitioners that has taught me so much, and I'm very excited to reconnect with them this summer. Yes?
I was just wondering whether in your time in Madagascar and learning about these Western pharmaceutical companies coming in to find medicines, whether it then leads to the, I don't know, this isn't the right word, but I don't know what the right word is, deforestation, so to speak, of those important herbs and plants that serve pharmacological purposes in Madagascar.
I'm not entirely sure, but the story that the pharmaceutical industries tell is that the local people are destroying the forest and therefore inhibiting the next cure for cancer, which kind of dodges the question of the destruction that they do cause. And the people that are closest to the resources and depend mostly on them are the ones most vulnerable. Yeah.
I have two questions. How are you going to communicate with all of these people? I assume that there are multiple languages if you're going into different villages with different tribes.
So in Madagascar, there's actually 18 different ethnic groups that each have their own version of Malagasy. So luckily for me, the community that I work with, they speak French, and I have a background in French. So through my broken French and their broken French, we can kind of connect. And of course, there's translators as well.
And then on a completely different, the flip side of that is, do you have any relationships within the pharmaceutical world in terms of, getting information from them firsthand?
I was hoping to connect with some of the companies in Madagascar that are Malagasy owned, that are interested in bioprospecting, to try and figure out how they negotiate their relationship to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So our next speaker is Leela Blat, concentrator in Africana Studies, and she is one of the recipients of the Ruth Simmons Prize for an outstanding honors thesis from any field on questions related to women or gender. Leela.
Hi. Well, just to continue the thank yous, thank you so much for coming and for taking a little bit of time to listen to me talk about my thesis. When I first found out that we only had 5 minutes to talk, I was like, what am I going to say? How do you capture 130 pages in 5 minutes? But I'm going to do my best. And I figured that I'd start off with a story that kind of helped me think about what I thought my thesis would be. So this past summer, Planned Parenthood interviewed for 2 articles on the future of the reproductive movement. One with the Huffington Post and one with New York Times. They were entitled, "We're Fighting for Access, Not Choice," and "Advocates Shun Pro-Choice to Expand the Message." These 2 articles featured Planned Parenthood as leaders in the developing shift away from choice and towards a broader framework of access. Planned Parenthood's president, Cecile Richards, characterized the organization's reevaluation of choice as an integral topic of conversation for the past few years within Planned Parenthood. Richards professed that choice no longer resonated with young women's lives, and while legal rights provided an essential milestone in the movement, issues of economic resources, affordable health care for women and their children needed to be represented within the organization's framework. Nowhere in either of these 2 articles did they name the long legacy of reproductive justice organizing by Black women and the past 2 decades of women of color's reproductive justice organizing. But however, in July of 2014, Planned Parenthood continued to emphasize that this radical reproductive justice model was their own framework, and that's how they were going to move forward. Now, Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, a leader in the reproductive rights movement, and the reproductive justice movement, refused to stay silent as Planned Parenthood co-opted the history of their movement and their ideological contributions. On August 5th, Sister Song published an open letter to Planned Parenthood. In this letter, Sister Song made the following demands. First, reproductive justice is the future of the reproductive movement. Second, as the larger movement transforms to incorporate reproductive justice, it has a responsibility to have women of color at the seats in the table, and not just as token members, but as serious contributors to what this movement is going to look like. And then their third demand said that Planned Parenthood, as an emblem of the mainstream reproductive rights movement, has a responsibility to interrogate the ways in which their organizing both supports and inhibits more liberatory women of color-led models. So watching this exchange at the end of the summer, I was like, this is going to be my thesis. I'm going to look at this exchange between Sister Song and Planned Parenthood and think what it's like for a more radical, women of color-led movement to have to negotiate with a mainstream movement. As my thesis moved along, it's transformed a lot. I decided that what I really wanted to do was kind of focus on what Black women and women of color specifically had done for themselves. And that in focusing on that interaction, it was in fact a continual erasure of what women of color have actually done for their own movement and working for themselves. So as I kind of started to shift away, I wanted to make sure that at every moment when I was thinking about what my project would be, I wanted to ask, how can I best highlight in the legacy of histories of medical violence, of coercive reproductive practices, what have Black women done in defense of themselves? Now you might notice I'm switching back and forth between Black women and women of color. My thesis has Black women in the title. Sister Song has women of color in the title. So although I intended to focus on Black women's reproductive justice organizing, I struggled to find an organization for Black women and by Black women that occupied a particularly visible national presence. So in a post-civil rights movement era, a nominally colorblind political moment where organizing around racial specificity is perceived as divisive rather than restorative, it's been very difficult for Black women to have their own valence to organize through. So I found that most Black women were operating through women of color rather than Black women specifically. So I decided that I would focus on Sister Song and consider the interaction of what does it mean to be a Black woman in a woman of color collective. Founded in 1997, Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective is now a leader in the reproductive justice movement. It's centered around Black women, Latino women, Asian American women, and Native women. Guiding Sister Song's activist interventions is the principle of reproductive justice, the belief that the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, economic, and social well-being of women and girls and will only be achieved when women and girls have the economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about their own bodies, sexuality, and reproduction for themselves, their families, and their communities in all areas of their lives. And that sounds particularly distinct from choice. And it doesn't sound like what Planned Parenthood has been organizing around all along. And so I decided that I didn't really want to focus on what Planned Parenthood was doing, and that I was going to center on with Sister Song's own ideological formations and what that looked like in practice. So Sister Song emerged out of a frustration with the mainstream feminist movement and their narrow focus on abortion and choice, particularly around contraception. And though I do talk about abortion and contraception, I use it more as an entry point to talk about how complicated it is if you expand just a narrow scope of legal rights. If you think about what does it mean to actually have choice, to think about your choices in the context of your intimate relationships with your families, your partners, your community, and the structures of power that you operate within. So for Sister Song, reproductive justice transcends the framework of legalized access and posits full reproductive autonomy as a human rights concern that the state and greater society has an obligation to address. So shifting my final focus to Sister Song raised new questions. What does it mean to create an activist collectivity through women of color? In the practice of solidarity, where do Black women fall? And in reproductive concerns that specifically implicate Black women's bodies, how does Sister Song mobilize their collective? So through archival research, participant observation, oral histories, policy analysis, and scholarly texts, my project interrogates the theoretical conditions of women of color solidarity in relation to the praxis of anti-Black violence in the United States. Sister Song emerged out of both of this frustration with the pro-choice movement and their individual choices and the desire to amplify women of color and racialized women's experiences with their conception of reproductive justice as the juncture between racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and gendered violence. Sister Song insisted that the concerns of multiply oppressed women are essential rather than marginal to crafting radical liberation. So this project uses Sister Song to explore the interplay between activists, the state, and biomedicine as it contests the boundaries of Black women's reproductive self-determination. And so my project really ultimately wanted to ask, what does it mean to have capacity in your daily rituals of life? In the daily time where you meet with your family, your partners, your community, your daily jobs, what does it mean to, in those daily intimate moments, practice freedom? And how does reproductive justice try and do that? So that's my thesis in a brief spiel. I have to take a moment to thank so many people. First, thank you so much to the Pembroke Center for honoring me and think that my thesis is worth something maybe. And I have to thank that my family came down today. My sister Nicole is here and she's very excited. I have to thank my mom for all that she's done for me and my incredible friends, which is my other family. And I also have to thank Professor Hamlin, who is here today. She was my second reader and has guided me so much in this process. And I have to thank my main advisor, Professor Lindamman. She couldn't be here today, but I actually couldn't have done this without her. So thank you so much. Yes.
Excellent work. I like how you adapted to the situation and were responsive to what was going on in the world. That's great. Let me ask what might be a bit of an elephant in the room.
Okay.
So as a Black lesbian, reproductive rights don't have a whole lot of resonance for me.
Right.
But there's a lot of great activism that's happened. Billie Avery, I don't know if you're familiar with her, et cetera. So a lot of great activism, which is not about reproductive rights. I mean, I think your sexual rights as a human right is really resonant, and I think that would be an interesting direction to look in. But I'm curious if you could talk about the resolution of women's rights,
Right.
women's sexual rights
Right.
versus reproductive rights.
Definitely. So I think part of an important distinction is that Sister Song isn't actually using the language of reproductive rights, they're using the language of justice, which they kind of captured and be kind of all-encompassing, that it's this like expansive framework that implicates all of these things. So a lot of what they say is like when we're talking about reproductive justice, we're also talking about being against violence from the state. We're also talking about sexual freedom. That it's this all-encompassing thing that's saying that all of these forces, my ability to have a job, to have a safe home, to be safe with my partner, is about my own personal justice that is implicated through my body, which I think is a little hard to capture as I'm framing this discussion in relationship to Planned Parenthood, but I ultimately think that Sister Song is doing something very different from how Planned Parenthood is talking about choice. And even in their shift towards access, they're still kind of very much talking about kind of individualized, market-driven choice.
So 2 questions about this really fantastic project. One, what was the greatest challenge that you found in writing it? And the question that someone on the council normally asks, where are you headed next?
Okay, fair questions. Challenges. I think one thing going into this project is I wanted it to be a lot more driven by activist voices, that I wanted to be able to do a lot of interviews. Ultimately, I was only able to conduct one interview of my own, which was a little sad. I think part of it is when you get an email from someone from afar, they're like, who is this person? I'm busy. But I went to the Color of Violence conference over spring break in Chicago, and I got to meet a lot of really incredible activists, and one of them was willing to interview with me, which I'm very grateful for. I'd say another tag challenge was in my second chapter. I do a lot of analysis of the prenatal non-discrimination legislation, and I think as far as writing, making an incoherent racial logic coherent to a reader was really challenging. And where I'm headed next, I'm actually moving to Chicago. I'm thinking very seriously about law school, but I also really want to tap into the reproductive justice organizing scene in Chicago. It's really vibrant and very actually Black women driven. So that's the hope. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, our next speaker is Patricia Eko, class of 15, concentrator in American Studies, in which she wrote her honors thesis, and for which she wanted a thesis prize. Congratulations, Patricia, for that. She's also a gender and sexuality studies concentrator, and she will be speaking about the research which was supported by the Helen Terry McLeod Research Grant to support research in any field for an honors thesis on issues related to women, gender, and sexuality. Patricia.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm very excited to be in such a supportive room. Excuse me, my thesis is entitled, Let's Be Very Public with Our Suffering, Tumbler's Online Depression and Its Queer Possibilities. Suffering is not a phenomenon isolated or specific to the chronically ill, mourning, or depressed. It is not an unusual or uncommon state of being, and it is not wholly or even interior to the individual. Suffering is an emotional state, a mode of affective comportment, and a social experience that is intrinsic to what it means to be human and to be with humans. In my thesis, I propose approaches to understanding sadness and suffering as within the realm of the everyday and the over or underwhelming. The use of social media, specifically the microblogging site Tumbler, is situated squarely in the everyday for many adolescents and young adults. Tumbler is an exemplar platform for public expression of suffering and empathetic relationality with and through sadness. Situating my analysis of depression, understood medically and otherwise, within the realm of Tumbler, allows for a conception of sustained and often debilitating sadness as the stuff of the everyday. The site Tumbler allows users to create an account or multiple accounts through which they blog or reblog images, text, videos, and GIFs. Users follow those with similar interests from whom they can reblog content and interact via private messages or tagging in posts. Hundreds and thousands of users, largely young adults, express their depression through desolate self-photography, reimagined media objects, and stylized text images. In the process of expressing their depression aesthetically and through interaction with others on Tumblr, I argue that users destigmatize public discussion of mental illness and reject popular understandings of mental illness as shameful, private, and individualized. Further, the invocation of depression in the public sphere of social media illuminates the social and cultural ideologies of depression that are often overlooked in favor of biological causation. Paired with social media, depression can be viewed as not an inherently or always debilitating condition that revokes relating with others, but as a viable mode of moving through the world and relating or not relating with others. The Tumblr platform thus allows individuals to touch each other intimately and remotely while grappling with the suffering of depression, a time in which the touch or recognition of others is most critical. I do not posit the site as a suicide hotline, nor do I argue that discussion with peers is sufficient to prevent situations of suicide. Rather than a life-saving force or intervention, I situate depressive interaction on Tumblr as a life-sustaining influence on many marginalized, depressed, or suicidal individuals. At its heart, this project is an assertion of the importance of touch and recognition through suffering and the queer potential that lies within an ethics of empathy and communication that centers sadness. In chapter 1 of my thesis, I analyzed the way in which engagement with and on Tumblr mirrors depression's time. Depression's present is often characterized by halting of action, lack of movement in time, incessant focus on the past and the present, and days that are repetitive and therefore devoid of significance. I examined Tumblr's interface and user practices and described the seeming endlessness of a scroll through Tumblr, the depressive fatigue it generates, and the distance relationality that it calls for. I argue also that the ability for many to experience depressive states via Tumblr makes more evident the universal fact of suffering and sadness and refutes depression as private and individual affliction. In chapter 2, I embrace Tumblr users' personal and political conceptions of aesthetics on their page and expand upon them to develop what I term a feminine queer of color depressive Tumblr aesthetic. Through close readings of images and text on the Tumblr pages of prominent feminine of color users, such as uglygirlsclub.tumblr.com and bluish.tumblr.com, I examine how users communicate a melancholic and radical vulnerability that is often rooted in medically diagnosed depression and which embraces excessive, deficient, and otherwise queer feelings, not as pathology, but as legitimate means of moving through the world. In chapter 3, I expound a formulation of queer depressive futurity that I term contingent futurity, which is defined by its contingency, or the knowledge and acceptance that the future may or may not happen. Through a choose-your-own-adventure format that mirrors contingent futurity's erratic orientation to the near future, I ask what relationship to the past, present, and future is made possible when one goes through life with death via suicide as a constant and viable option, and how this embrace of suffering and unknowingness can allow for a fundamental openness. I analyzed the blog post of queer femme blogger Mark Aguiar, who committed suicide in 2012, and center her remembrance of death as an axis of queer contingent futurity. Together, these chapters assert the importance of public displays of suffering in order to remove the stain and stigma of privatizing sadness and depression. In this contemporary period, depression and suicide are not unspoken entities. In fact, they are a frequent sensationalist mainstay of many mainstream news and entertainment outlets. I aim here to expand the limited and particular instances in which these topics are discussed and by whom. Outside of the news of a suicide or report of national statistics of depression, There's a deadening silence about mental illness and the threat of suicide in the everyday areas of work and school and within interpersonal relations. Relation through sadness allows for more empathetic communication and for the recognition of suffering as a universal human experience. And this recognition pulls those who are suffering with depression or otherwise into the everyday. Ultimately, I argue that public expressions of sadness, suffering, and depression allow us to more fully and lovingly recognize ourselves and others, and through this recognition, alleviate forms of sadness. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Pembroke Center for their very generous support, and also Professor Weinstein, with whom I worked through a chapter in our Gen 6 capstone, and also my advisor, Leticia Alvarado in American Studies, and Wendy Chun in MCM. Thank you.
That's really wonderful. A wonderful presentation, and I'm sure a great thesis and research. So do you have any sense of the impact that the accessing on a regular basis on Tumblr has on the people who are entering the site?
Right. With my project, I didn't, there was no face-to-face contact with the actual users. I analyzed their pages and the site itself as like an aesthetic and a sphere through which they might not represent exactly themselves, because there's no way of knowing, but an important facet of themselves that they interact with on the everyday. And I think through examining pages like Mark Aguilar, who had one important post that was entitled "How to Stave Off Suicide for a Couple of Hours," that became popular on Tumblr, and through which I think many people were touched, and through just looking at the thousands of reblogs that it had, and I analyzed that as evidence of Tumblr as sort of this life-sustaining arena that might most likely have sustained her life for a while.
Oh, it's very moving.
This summer, I am TAing a high school course at University of Michigan on Black mass incarceration, and then I am seeing what happens next.
Okay. Our next grant recipient is Elaine Shang, class of 15. Elaine is a health and human biology concentrator. I hope she won't mind my mentioning that she has completed almost all of the requirements for the Gender and Sexuality Studies concentration as well, and so I consider her an honorary GNSS concentrator as well. Elaine is the recipient of the Barbara Anton Internship Grant to support an honors senior thesis involving an internship or volunteer work in a community agency. Elaine.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Weinstein, and thank you all for being here and supporting me. And I really wanted to thank the Pembroke Center for the Barbara Anton Internship Grant, because I was able to do a lot more research and visit and interview a lot more people than I would have without it. So it really helped. So I lied. That's not my project. I actually decided to change my focus after I applied for this grant, so I hope they don't think I'm a really bad person or anything, but it's related, I swear. It's just, I had a talk with my professor, well, my thesis advisor after, and she looked me straight in the eye after I'd submitted this proposal, and she was like, Elaine, I was like, yes, and she was like, this is 10 books, and I was like, oh, and so she wanted me to focus a little more, and she took me to see the Lieutenant Governor of Rhode Island, and we had a meeting on a trans resource guide project that they were doing, and it's in the works right now, and after I went home and thought about it, and I decided to focus on the transgender populations, and also just the Affordable Care Act. So the new title is actually Mapping Unsafe Spaces, Trans Health, and the Affordable Care Act. So hopefully it's a little related, but not exactly that. And anyway, so So what I decided to do was I wanted to look into policy a little more. It was an area that I haven't really focused on at all in my time at Brown. So I studied human bio and global health disparities, but this was my first time looking at laws and also just the different legislation that impacts trans folk in the U.S. And it was actually a very frustrating process, just trying to figure out how invisible trans people were in the U.S., even though the ACA, Affordable Care Act, has been trying to improve access to care for LGBTQ people in general, but I feel like trans people are largely ignored even when we talk about LGBT. So basically what I did all year was I kind of like just focused on all of the states, so all 50 states, and then looked at different policies that might impact access to trans health. That includes like discrimination laws, but it also includes Medicaid laws and also coverage laws for transition-related care or other services. So it was around like 10 laws for all 50 states, so it was kind of like a mess sometimes. But it was really interesting to finally just get all of the information in one place. So my thesis has 3 parts. The first part is just epidemiology, just because there's not too much research on transgender people in general. They tend to be understudied and ignored, and even in medical and scientific research. So I decided to put everything together to see how much information I can get. And I started actually with semantics, so I did definitions of like very basic terms that a lot of GNSS concentrators like know off the top of their head, like sex, gender, etc. But it's really surprising how like messy it can get at the legal and policy levels when different states don't define sex and gender the same way, and then they can use it against trans people, which is not okay. And in my second part, that's where I kind of like decided to start analyzing how the Affordable Care Act has impacted trans folk, and that includes, at like the broadest level, the health insurance marketplace. I don't know how many of you guys know the Affordable Care Act, but the marketplace is basically a way for people to get health insurance if they don't have it already. They can purchase it based on their states. So like the ACA has come out and said the marketplace cannot discriminate against transgender people or based on gender identity. But then I decided to look deeper and see if that was really true. So what was very fascinating was like there's this broad statement that isn't supported by actual legislation, but then when you go to state by state, because Medicaid is state driven, so when you look at each state, different states might say, well, being transgender is a blanket exclusion, so we allow health insurance companies to say, oh, you're transgender, that's a pre-existing condition, so we're just going to deny you care altogether because you cost too much. You have the potential to cost too much, and that was very interesting to me that states are still allowing this. So out of all 50 states, only 10 states have said health insurance companies cannot discriminate in that way, which is terrible, in my opinion. It's 1/5 of the country. And within those 10 states, only 8 states have said, okay, our Medicaid plans will cover some form of transition-related care, which can include hormones, it can include surgery, it can include mental health services, etc. And then within those 8 states, only 6 states have said we'll cover at least some surgery, because that is the most costly portion of care a lot of the times. So at the end of the day, I made these maps, which I should have shown. I'm really sorry I didn't bring them. But it's just it made me very upset to see how, in theory, trans people should be able to get all the care, all the medically necessary care they need. But at the end of the day, like, insurance companies can exploit that and say, well, these laws don't prevent us from saying no, so we will, because they want to make money a lot of the time, and they don't want to pay for the care. And that was my second part. But in the third part of my thesis, that's where all these kind of like organizations came in that I interviewed. I focused on Fenway Health and also the Rhode Island Public Health Institute for like ease, I guess, just because I could travel and also email and talk to a lot of the people there more easily. And my thesis advisor is actually the executive director of RIPHI, and that made things even easier. But basically, I was able to learn more about how these organizations are kind of providing the interface between trans communities and also like the policy aspect in federal and state laws, so that maybe we can make things more transparent and kind of like move forward with these laws. Thank you.
Can I just check first a few facts and then ask you a question? You're saying that 10 states explicitly say they will cover.
No, so 10 states explicitly state that they cannot,
That they will.
will not do blanket exclusions. Right.
And are there any states that say explicitly that they will?
Yes, 8.
8. Do we know whether the remaining states that are neither absolutely yes and absolutely no, absolutely no, what their policies actually are? Are you assuming that their silence means no, or do you know that?
So I took it as assuming silence means no, just because in general, when you don't, like the sad thing is if you don't explicitly state you will cover something, insurance companies generally will not cover it. That was the trend when I was looking up news articles and also a lot of the Medicaid websites. Some Medicaid websites will say, like state-by-state websites, they'll say, services not listed here will not be covered.
Okay, so then the next question is, have you or do you know of anybody who's challenged any of these exclusions, explicit or implicit, as inconsistent with the Affordable Care Act?
So
or are we just going to study this and say that's terrible?
No. So yes, there are people that can challenge these laws, but the challenges they only have a chance to be like really appealed and be successful in the states that explicitly state that they won't have blanket exclusions. So the National Transgender Law Center is a really great resource for people who want to challenge and appeal, perhaps like they thought their health insurance plan was discriminating against them. But in general, I think only in the states that have said we ban blanket exclusions is it like feasible to kind of say, okay, we can take this to court.
Well, I don't know, a couple of other lawyers here would probably join me in arguing that if somebody in the states that are silent applies for that kind of coverage and is turned down, they then have a case. So I think we haven't asked you the question where you're going, but you need to go to law school.
I don't know. I'm overwhelmed by law. I'm doing AmeriCorps next year. I'm working at Lift Communities. It's a poverty organization. But after that, I'm hoping to go to med school, actually. So.
Is Rhode Island one of the 10?
Is Rhode Island? No, it is not. So I'm actually working this summer on an article that my advisor and I will hopefully submit to try and change Rhode Island's laws.
Are the 10 concentrated in any part?
Divided, polarized between West and East Coast, or Northeast. Yeah. Thank you.
Our next presenter, Bennett Knox, is a dual concentrator in biology and gender and sexuality studies. And for his outstanding thesis in gender and sexuality studies, he's the recipient of the Joan Scott Prize. Turn things over to Bennett.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, everyone who made this day possible. And thank you especially to Professor Weinstein. I could not have done this thesis without her. So my name is Bennett. I'm a double concentrator in gender sexuality studies and biology, and my thesis is titled Damaged Brain or Damaged Rhetoric, a critique of biological conceptions of depression. The project was originally inspired by a set of parallels that I noticed between the ways that many LGBT advocates were talking about sexuality and the ways that many psychiatrists and anti-stigma advocates talk about mental illness, specifically depression. Perhaps many of you are familiar with the idea that LGBT people are born this way. This assertion, which is usually taken to mean that sexuality is purely biologically determined, and it often forms the basis of arguments that LGBT people have no choice in the matter of their sexualities and therefore do not deserve discrimination. I noticed that many organizations were relying on similar rhetoric in order to assert that people with depression are not deserving of discrimination on the basis of their mental illness. This rhetoric, which I call damaged brain rhetoric, asserts that depression is primarily biologically caused, the result of a biologically damaged brain. This rhetoric invokes the language of chemical imbalances, neurotransmitter deficiencies, damaged circuitry, etc. Similar to assertions that LGBT people are born this way, I found that damaged brain rhetoric was often used to argue that people with depression have no control over their own conditions, and therefore do not deserve to be stigmatized or discriminated against. Now let me be clear, I do not think that either of these groups deserve to be stigmatized or discriminated against whatsoever. Nevertheless, I questioned whether insisting on the biological nature of sexuality or depression was the best way to address these issues. My thesis, therefore, is essentially a critique of this damaged brain rhetoric. Ultimately, my goal is the development of more nuanced and politically useful conceptions of depression, which may help guide research and reduce stigma. I argue that although assertions of depression's biological nature may sometimes be useful for certain purposes, they will ultimately fail to produce an appropriately nuanced model of depression and will fail to adequately address the stigma and discrimination facing this vulnerable population. I want to make it clear that my thesis is not an argument that depression is not real, nor is it an argument that people with depression are somehow to blame for their own conditions, or that they could somehow get over it through sheer force of will. I argue instead that depression should be seen as real and blameless, regardless of whether or not it is viewed as biological. My thesis had 3 chapters, each of which served a different purpose. The first was a historical analysis, which situated this issue in its historical context. The second chapter was a comparative analysis between this damaged brain rhetoric and the born this way rhetoric that I alluded to earlier. And my third chapter examined how this particular rhetoric works through the specific example of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and then explored alternative frameworks for reimagining depression. Ultimately, I conclude that damaged brain rhetoric relies on the assumption that we can easily divide developmental factors into those that are based on the social and those that are biological. I argue that this is a simplistic way of understanding how humans develop. Drawing on the work of Anne Fausto Sterling, among others, I take a developmental systems theory approach. This theory stresses the ways in which social and biological factors are actually deeply intrinsically linked through the process of development. Factors that we may tend to view as social may in fact create identifiable biological difference, especially where the developing brain is concerned. And factors that we may tend to view as completely biological can carry out their effects only on an individual in a particular social context. I believe that this view of social and biological factors as not obviously distinct, but rather as intimately bound up in one another, will lead us to more productive understandings of depression than damaged brain rhetoric ever could. To conclude, my thesis is not meant to cover every aspect of depression. However, I hope that it can provide some starting place to build more nuanced and productive conceptions of this important phenomenon.
Hi, very interesting, thank you. Anne Fausto Sterling was actually very influential in the way I view the entire universe, so. So you're basically, so are you talking about sort of epigenetic interactions?
Yeah, that's definitely a piece.
And have they, have studies been done, or has anyone identified various epigenetic changes on the DNA that are, directly? Oh, sorry.
Oh, epigenetic.
Okay.
Yes. So
I'm sorry, that's a good point.
Epigenetics sort of being like the way that extrinsic factors can affect the way genes are expressed.
Yes,
roughly.
they basically they can determine whether a gene is open to be expressed or not. They don't have the kind of specificity that the genetic does. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
But so I guess there is some research being done, and part of my thesis is sort of to gesture towards where the research needs to be. And part of it, I think, for instance, like we should be studying how treatments that we think of as social are can actually enact biological change on an individual,
So
or things like that. Right. So I sort of gesture towards that in my thesis. There is some, but not a huge amount. Right?
Interesting.
What are you doing next?
I'm currently looking for work in the medical field, and I'm going to sort of make a final decision about whether I'm going to apply to med school or grad school.
Our next presenter is Charlotte Lindamman, who will be graduating with a degree in English. She is also a recipient of a Ruth Simmons Prize for an outstanding honors thesis from any field on questions related to women and gender. Charlotte.
I also want to thank all of you for being here and the Pembroke Center for this wonderful prize, and of course everyone who made this day possible. I'm very nervous, so I prepared by writing out every single thing I'm going to say. So I called my thesis Visions and Vertigo and the Turn of the Screw. So as you can see, it's a comparison between two very different things in two very different media produced in two very different contexts. Henry James's late 19th century short story, The Turn of the Screw, and Alfred Hitchcock's mid-1960s Hollywood film Vertigo. So the idea for this strange comparison actually came pretty naturally out of a chance juxtaposition of two classes I took my junior year here at Brown. The very last final I handed in before winter break of my junior year was a seminar paper on Hitchcock's Vertigo, and the very first thing I read back at school after winter break was Henry James's Turn of the Screw. So although I'm sure such an origin story must appear to make this comparison seem more rather than less arbitrary, in the next 5 minutes I'm going to try to show you a little bit of why I thought that wasn't the case. So the seminar paper I wrote on Vertigo ended up being mostly dominated, argument-wise, by Laura Mulvey's canonical visual pleasure and narrative cinema, which was an enabling read for me because by denaturalizing vision and showing how the objects of vision objects of vision are constructed for our eyes by pre-existing social frameworks, Mulvey for the first time forced me to see vision as always already mediated. Mulvey's essay, which written in the 70s laid the foundation for a tradition of feminist film criticism, argues that looking, and therefore also by extension cinema, is a mechanism of male power. So coming out of my Vertigo paper, where I spent pages and pages describing how the camera calls attention to its own hand in constructing the ideal woman it pictures as its ghostly heroine by framing her in mirrors, windows, and doors, when I found the governess of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw seeing ghosts also framed by mirrors, windows, and doors, I couldn't help but see Mulvey's male gaze, and I couldn't help but start wondering what happens when the bearer of Mulvey's male gaze is in fact a woman. Of course, this effect of seeing what had already been in my mind everywhere in new places it didn't belong, or in other words, of seeing The Turn of the Screw as haunted by an essay written more than half a century later about a medium that hadn't yet been invented, was precisely the determining effect of vision I was criticizing my two protagonists for. So the question that framed my writing was how to read two texts together without reading one through the other, without letting my prior reading of one determine the other, force it to fit into the ghost of a past argument. And so I spent 67 pages trying to do that, and instead of trying to summarize it, which I'm really bad at, I wanted to just read for you the last 2 pages of my thesis, which were about vertigo, and I'm going to jump right in, which I'm sure will be disorienting, but as this is an essay about vertigo, I think that's the theme. So, to begin. If Vertigo's first-time viewer catches Scotty's adult eyesight and is implicated, as Mulvey suggests, in his male gaze, Vertigo does not bind the viewer to his first impression as Mulvey does. The object Vertigo offers to its viewer's vision is not fixed, but allows the wandering course of the viewer's eyes to be different upon every rewatching. For example, the fragmenting lens of the title credits that first seemed an allegory of the violence inflicted by the male gaze in constructing its ideal from the severed pieces of a woman equally demonstrates a desire to break the surface of that oppressive image. The woman's face behind the title credits does not belong to the film's female lead, Kim Novak. Referentless in the film's diegesis, it is itself only a sign for woman, or person. Both the conventional sight of human individuality and an image that the narrative does not back with a person, this face that should be an identity seems only a depthless surface. Composed as much by a layer of makeup as skin, the image thus draws attention to the filmic face as surface. Its surfaceness seems to stress that all vision ever sees is the surface, that if the subject's world is assembled of acts of vision, and if every act of vision excludes something from its frame, there will always be an imperceivable concealed behind the perceivable. Diving into the pupil of a woman's eye, Vertigo asks the self-conscious question the male gaze perversion of the governess's model of vision never touches. If there is an invisible behind the visible, what is inside a person? Lingering like a blazon over a cheek, a pair of lips, a pair of eyes, the camera turns the face into a text. From such a perspective, the credits are a lesson in close reading. The lens zooms in on a single eye, which, widening in surprise, emits the word vertigo and swallows the camera. Inside the eye, there's only a black screen and a succession of spiraling helixes, performing the vertiginous turns implied by the film's title. The credit sequence that titles the film Vertigo, itself a kind of title to the film, performs the title it produces by gesturing to the infinite deferral of meaning in the search from sign to sign. Vertigo, a sign that refers both to the film and to the visual impairment, is rendered in the opening credits as a search that spirals into symbols that are symbols of symbols. The question of the essence behind the image of woman unravels into a sequence of movement as such, into an absolute flow of becoming that is a new thing at every instance. If the image of woman as a surface is disenchanted, it is disenchanted not by the quest to see depth, but by the absence of a depth that is anything more fixed than motion itself. Both surfaces themselves and symbols of perpetual motion, the helixes undo recognition's definition of a person. A performance of its title and a synecdoche of the film, the seemingly infinite supply of helixes refuses to be fixed. Therefore, like the turn of the screw, with each new outbreak, Vertigo keeps interpretation turning. Perhaps, like Douglas's answer, I haven't one, when asked, what is your title? The question Vertigo frames itself hasn't one either. Like the governess's name, the answer is left blank for the viewer. Thank you very much. And I want to thank my two wonderful thesis advisors who couldn't be here, Richard Rambus and Deke Neighbors. Owe it all to them. And again, thank you so much to the Pembroke Center. This is such an honor to be here. Yeah.
Are you going to go to graduate school?
English? I haven't applied or anything. I'm very seriously considering it. I think I would like to, but yeah, I don't know what comes after graduate school, so it's not a question I guess I'm very well prepared to answer.
Are there particular problems in comparing a work from a film and the literary world? I mean, everyone, always, you go to dinner party, people are always saying, oh, I saw the play so-and-so, and it was far better than the movie. And I say, well, there's no car chases or close-ups, so how could that be, So,
Yeah.
but were there particular problems in taking works of art from two different fields and then?
Definitely. That was the question that when I first proposed this project, everybody came back at me with, and I sort of wanted to say, why should there be any problem if you can read a movie in the same way you can read a novel, then why shouldn't we be able to compare them both on the equal access of interpretation, I guess. And obviously, the deeper I got into the project, that became a huge problem. And the question of media became sort of central to my thesis, and that's how I ended up with vision, because I talk about how the way vision is depicted in the novel sort of echoes the way that vision, like the way the media of film acts upon the viewer's vision. I don't know if that made any sense.
Is there a methodology that you could apply to any film or novel?
Kind of.
Like how to compare works of art from vastly different fields. Just a window to that.
Yeah, I think so. It sounds sort of corny when I put it in so few words, but the conclusion I sort of came to is that our first impressions determine the way we think about everything from there on. So I guess you could apply that to life in general or to anything else.
And finally, we're going to hear from Esme Ricciardi, who will be graduating with a degree in international relations. She's the recipient of a Steinhaus-Zissen Pembroke Center research grant for the research that she's about to tell us about.
Hi. So I'm graduating in international relations, and this is my project. I also lied. That's not the title of my thesis, but it's pretty close. The actual title of my thesis ended up being Islamic Immigration, Sex Trafficking, and the Media, the Implications of Gendered and Racialized Trafficking Narratives in the Netherlands. I'm not going to do my whole spiel about my methods and findings, but I'm going to give you maybe the premise, my conclusions, and a little bit of how it relates to the work of the Pembroke Center, because it's not I think that when I presented this for IR, I really moved away from the gendered issue. It's nice to have an audience that's maybe a little bit more interested in that. So this kind of came out of a class that I took with Kay Warren, who was closely affiliated with the Pembroke Center and would have been my advisor had she been here this year, but she was on sabbatical doing her own work. And before I had taken that class, I was already very interested in the topic of sex workers' rights and human trafficking. And after taking that class, my idea of what that was had completely changed. And it's a very divisive topic in the feminist field. And so I'm not going to posit to go one way or the other on it, but my work really tried to look at how perspectives on human trafficking can impact other aspects of life and of government and of media. So in that class, she actually had us look at a specific case that was relevant to something that was important to our own lives. So I looked at the case of the lover boys in the Netherlands because my mother, who is here, is Dutch, grew up in the Netherlands. I spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, so I wanted to sort of look into that area a little bit more. And the lover boys was this really fascinating case because it's a human trafficking narrative, human trafficking being the movement of people from one area to the other, often for sale and for exploitation. It's a pretty broadly defined term depending on who you ask, but this is a specific case of sex trafficking where women, generally young women, potentially in high school or a little bit older, are stalked and pursued, I guess, by men who then date them, get them to fall in love with them, and convince them to enter the sex work field for their own benefit. Sex work and pimping are both completely legal in the Netherlands. There's no ban on it, so it shouldn't technically be illegal for a man to benefit off of the profits of his girlfriend's sex work, but because it's being framed as a trafficking issue, it's now illegal. And the interesting thing for me was that it's a racialized narrative. It's consistently white women, especially when you see movies. There have been tons of made-for-TV movies about it where it's this blonde, blue-eyed woman. She's maybe 16 or 17, very scared, and falls in love with a Moroccan man. And if anyone has sort of knows what's going on in Western Europe right now with regards to Islamic immigration, the Islamic immigrants are largely vilified. They're seen as a plague on all of Western Europe. They're seen as infiltrating the country. There's this big fear that they're going to one day overtake the the domestic population, and it's going to become Muslim Europe. It's a big buzzword phrase. And so this trafficking narrative seems to play out one of those fears, which is that a Muslim man is going to come into the community, infiltrate, and then cause the downfall of perhaps feminism. And what I found was that it's this gendered narrative that keeps coming up again and again in the media, not just in trafficking narratives, but all over, where it's easier to justify racism when you can use it through the lens of sexism. And you can say Islamic people are anti-feminist, and that's sort of a very general statement, but it's one that's commonly used in the media. And that's sort of where I went with this, and I really dug into it. I had one chapter that was very much just looking at overall how are Islamic people portrayed in the media in a gendered lens, and then also how are specifically Muslim men viewed in the context of this lover boys framework. And I compared it against a case in America that Pardis Mahdavi had done. She released a book the same year that I was working on this, and so it worked out nicely. It was called From Trafficking to Terror, and she found that in America, so there was a similar case where the trafficking narrative that was playing out in America, has anyone seen the movie Taken? Okay, I'm assuming some people have. It's this movie where a white woman is violently taken by a brown man, and she's forced into sex trafficking, and then her dad has to come save her. It's a chase movie. But basically that's kind of the narrative that we see in America, is we're very afraid that a white woman is going to be taken by a brown man, and she's going to be forced into sex trafficking. And it's a very international issue. And here in America, we're focused on international trafficking. The TIP report very much focuses on what's happening in the developing world, and what's happening in the TIP report, is the Trafficking in Persons report, which is one of the major American initiatives against human trafficking. And so we're very focused on international trafficking in America. And we're also very focused on international issues of Islam. The primary issue in America is when we're talking about Muslim people and we think about what's the fear tends to be fear of terrorists in the Middle East. And so I sort of compared that international trafficking focus, that international Islamophobia, to the domestic Islamophobia and the domestic trafficking issue that you see in the Netherlands. And I basically find that 9/11, this is really jumping to the conclusion of my thesis, which I obviously can't get to all of my findings, but I find that 9/11 was a turning point in both cases. In both cases, before 9/11, there really wasn't a ton of interest in these racialized trafficking narratives, but after 9/11, they become very popular. I find that liberal states, such as the Netherlands, which is generally a very tolerant liberal state, and the US, which is arguably a very liberal tolerant state, justify intolerance and Islamophobia by using narratives that support and protect women, and those narratives are localized to where the state has concerns. And in this case, women, this is kind of how it relates to the Pembroke Center, women are used as a representative of the state in both cases. They are being violated by another ethnic group, they're being violated by the other, and there's a white woman who's held up as a symbol of the state, and her violation is used to support policies of anti-immigration in the Netherlands. It's become widely popular for the anti-immigration parties to be elected into office. There's many anti-immigration policies that have gone into place. And in the US to support anti-terrorist measures, obviously. We've had a couple of wars based on that. And I was the recipient of the Steinhaus Citizen Grant, which really focuses on preference given to research on women's education, health, community activism, philanthropy, economic status, and women's rights. Broad topic, but have I really touched on that yet? Probably not. But the interesting thing for my thesis, and why I think it really relates into that, is the implications of this, which the anti-immigration policies that arise out of these trafficking narratives, which are very much being used to support anti-immigration policy and anti-trafficking measures. They're both being used essentially to deport women who are coming into the Netherlands. A lot of times, women who are there are considered trafficked because they've been brought in by men who are now seen as traffickers, and so the women who are with them are then seen as trafficked. And so it's become the basis for deportation, and it's become the basis for rampant Islamophobia, which tends to cause decreased economic status for women over men. Women are largely the harmed parties by a lot of these policies. So that's sort of what I did. Thank you so much to the Pembroke Center for helping me out with this project. I could not have done it without this grant. It was a fantastic blessing, and thanks to my family for being here, and thank you to Kay Warren, and as well as to my two thesis advisors who couldn't be here today, but Claudia Elliott and Elaine Shang. So thank you. Okay.
You mentioned at the beginning you presented a different version of this to IR.
Yeah.
What was the difference?
It was very, very focused on the policy issues, and it was very focused on the Islam issue, which is, I think, a little bit more hot button right now. Just because of Charlie Hebdo, I think that's kind of how I started my presentation for IR. I talked a lot about how Charlie Hebdo is sort of this example in France. Obviously, the EU was my initial focus, and so I did look at how the issues in France and Germany and the UK started to influence the situation in the Netherlands. So, yeah.
Did you say where you're going?
Oh, no, I can tell you. I'm moving to New York City. I'm going to be a paralegal for a year, and then I'm planning on applying to law school in the fall and going to law school after that. Yeah.
I just want to extend a final note of congratulations to all of our grant and prize winners. They really are just fantastic projects.